Morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This webinar this morning is being sponsored by ECEPS, the Early Care and Education Pathways to Success. It is what we're calling a deep dive, and we will be offering these webinars 3 to 4 times a year on topics that are specifically relevant to folks in ECE interested in developing or sustaining or expanding apprenticeships for the early education workforce and related sort of tangential occupations like home visiting. And so I think it's fitting that we start with Adele this morning. I'm not going to do a formal introduction because I suspect there's no one on this call who doesn't have some idea who, or at least they have their perspective of who Adele is. We'd have to get her daughters on the call to find out what their perspective on who Adele is. But clearly she's the, I don't know what, alternate chief or something like that at DAS. I'm sorry, Adele, I just didn't want to go looking up here, but she works at the DAS. That's what everyone knows. And what everyone also knows is her presence at the DAS has made a very big difference, both in terms of the DAS being the Division of Apprenticeship Standards, being responsive, being innovative, being better organized, being better staffed, although I don't think you can take full credit for that. That's some part of budget issues, I understand. But it has made a big difference. And simultaneously, as Adele knows, the interest in ECE apprenticeships has just gone, very steadily increased over the past 7 years or so. And now I think the slope is even steeper. And so it just seemed like, because when we talk to folks around the state, whether it's colleges or employers or policymakers, everybody's almost their first question is, how do you fund these things? And so it seemed fitting to have Adele be the first person to speak on this deep dive, also because there are some new funding things coming down the pike that are so relevant and so exciting. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to turn the mic over to Adele. If you have questions, how do we have this set up, Barbara, for people to put it in the Q&A box or in the chat box?
The chat box.
Okay, so if you have questions, put it in the chat box. We won't take them as we're going, but we'll have them there at the end. And I've instructed Adele to make sure she leaves time, because if I know something about the group who's on this call, there's going to be a lot of questions of wanting her to get very specific about very important things. So with that, Adele, thank you and welcome, and the floor is yours.
Amazing. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I am the Deputy Chief at the Division of Apprenticeship Standards, and I think an informal title could be Apprenticeship Funding Geek. That's definitely an area that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on. And so I am very happy to be here today and to be deep diving into one of my favorite subjects. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to share my screen and get this presentation started here. So I will say, as we dive into this, I took the title of deep dive very literally, and I will say that, one second, I'm going to get this. Oh, nope, that didn't work. Sorry, just getting the. Maybe I should have started screen sharing earlier. There we go. And
usually you can hit where it says swap.
There we go.
There you go. Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. So I took it literally with the deep dive. So I am going to definitely spend this whole time talking about apprenticeship funding. So I am assuming that coming into this conversation, you know what an apprenticeship is, and you know sort of at least the sort of basics of apprenticeship. So I'm going to dive deep into this geeky topic of apprenticeship funding in the hopes to be as helpful to you as I can. And yes, I will attempt to stay disciplined to keep some time for questions, because I could talk a lot about this subject, and I want to make sure that I am answering the questions that are on your mind. So just to do a little bit of context setting, in the funding history in California, we certainly had a major advocate step in when Gavin Newsom became governor, and it's been an ongoing area of investment for California. But I do think that this most recent budget cycle of 2022 is going to be an important milestone in this history because we have a major new investments into apprenticeship with the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding, which I will definitely be talking more about here today, along with an investment into youth apprenticeship. So big investments this year specifically into apprenticeship. So I'm excited to unpack more of those for you today. Another thing that I will just speak very quickly to is that we have put together this 5-point action plan around how we expand apprenticeship in California. And by the way, I will absolutely be sharing all of these slides afterwards. So if you're curious, you can click through on these links to learn a little bit more about our overall strategy. And certainly just a few things I would pluck out here is that we are really trying to support regional and sectoral apprenticeship intermediaries, which ECEPS is a fantastic example of a sector intermediary for the early care and education sector. And so we're very excited about their work. And as you'll hear, some of the apprenticeship investments are really targeted towards developing this whole ecosystem of apprenticeship intermediaries and creating a sustainable model for them. And we see this as really critical to expanding new and innovative apprenticeships, which is a big key focus area. I also would pluck out here youth apprenticeship, which again, you'll hear in the investments that we're making into youth apprenticeship. But I know that specifically early care and education has been an early mover in this space, and that, you know, ECEPS has partnered with folks to create some youth apprenticeship programs. And I think that there's a lot of room for expansion of those. And again, there are some new resources around that. So I will speak to that so that you know about all of that. And then finally, I'll say that expanding state and local public sector apprenticeships is also key, which comes into the whole, you know, education is part of our public sector. I know early care and education is sort of on that cusp right now, but point is, all of these strategic areas really do align with your sector. And so I hope you're coming out of this presentation today feeling like you're better understanding the situation, and also knowing that like we are strategically really excited to be supporting your work. So just a few definition of terms here. Many of you have probably heard me talk about the role of apprenticeship intermediaries, but certainly when you're gathering a new apprenticeship program, you do need to think about all the different stakeholders that you're gathering in an apprenticeship. And I think that people often think about the sort of outside of the circle, right? That like apprenticeship starts with the employers. You need to bring educators in so that they're doing that instruction for apprentices. You need to register that with the government. Often you're working with a CBO or a workforce board to support the apprentices. But in the middle of this is like the glue that brings it all together, which is the term that we use for apprenticeship intermediaries. And who plays that role can look a lot of different ways as we expand apprenticeship into a lot of different sectors. And so I just wanted to be sure to define this term because I'm going to use it throughout the presentation. So I want to make sure you understand what I mean when I'm saying it, which is really what an apprenticeship intermediary does is that they aggregate the needs of multiple employers. They bring all those stakeholders together to create a program, to register it. They also often play the role of recruiting apprentices, placing them in their apprenticeship, supporting them, providing supportive services, and really running and scaling the program. And so we want to be creating a whole layer of these entities. And these entities historically have been the unions in like the building trades, for example, and they can be as we expand into new sectors with apprenticeship, but it could also be workforce boards, it can be educational institutions, consortiums, nonprofits, industry associations, staffing agencies. So it can look a lot of different ways. So this is what I mean when I say apprenticeship intermediaries, and this is certainly a strategic area. And then the final term definition I'll give here is in California, the way we organize apprenticeship is into this two areas of the California Apprenticeship Council, which oversees all of the traditional apprenticeships in the building and the fire trades. And then in 2018, we created the Interagency Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship, also shorthand is IACA. And this is the committee that is advising on the expansion of apprenticeship into a whole lot of different sectors, including early care and education. So again, you might hear me throughout this presentation talking about IACA apprentices, and this is this is my shorthand for talking about IACA apprentices. So know that early care and education falls under that category of IACA apprentices in California. So with that, what I'm here to say about apprenticeship funding is that the good news is that there is a lot of apprenticeship funding out there. There's a lot of workforce funding out there at the state level, at the federal level. There's a lot of funding, which is very exciting. Slightly less good news is that it can be tricky to navigate. So, and to decide like where to focus your energies, right? Like which funding sources to invest your time and energy into tapping into. So my goal here in this conversation today is to help you navigate, like how to help you think about navigating the different funding sources, and probably to give you a few threads that you're going to pull yourself to learn more about, because I couldn't possibly in the time here talk about every single funding source. So that's my goal here. And as I've been sort of thinking about apprenticeship funding, there's a few different ways to think about all of the different sources of workforce funding, really is the sort of broadest category. And you can think about the different funding sources through the lens of how much is this funding source focused on apprenticeship specifically, versus having some broader scope to it. You can think about it from the dimension of what does this funding cover, right? Like of your operating budget, what is this funding covering? But also very important to think about is the sustainability of the funding. And that's from the perspective both of, does it cover startup or does it cover like ongoing operation? And also, is this like a one-time budget allocation, or is this something that's likely to be an ongoing funding source? So I'll try to touch a bit on all of these dimensions as they're relevant to launching and running ECE programs. So when you're to take that first lens of like how apprenticeship specific is the funding, so I've sort of organized it into all of the potential funding sources, I've attempted to, into these three sort of concentric circle areas. So apprenticeship specific funding. So these are sources of funding that go 100% towards apprenticeship or pre-apprenticeship. And then I'm categorizing groups by apprenticeship adjacent funding, which is funding that's commonly used for apprenticeships or pre-apprenticeships, but it's not exclusively for apprenticeships or pre-apprenticeships. And then there's a vast array of workforce funding that could be used for apprenticeship, but in its intent is maybe sector focused or population focused. So I'll try to touch on all of these. So starting with just the lens of apprenticeship specific funding. And my color coding here is yellow is available specifically in California, gray is available nationally, and the sort of bolded outlined yellow is the new funding sources that were created in this budget year. So as you can see, I am representing DAS here. So obviously I put us at the top of the list. So we have a few new sources of funding. So I'm going to speak specifically to each of these, the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding, the support side, and the training side of that. We also have a California Youth Apprenticeship Grant, which we're working on. And then we also have an Equal Representation in Construction Apprenticeship Grant. If I have time, I will touch on this one a little bit because it does have an interesting intersection with ECE potentially, but that is more for the construction trades. And then we also do administer what's called the CAC training funds, but that will be less relevant to you. So the next area is California Apprenticeship Initiative grants, CAI, which are currently open for applications. So I'm definitely going to tell you more about that. Related and supplemental instruction is another category of apprenticeship specific funding. This one's going to be less relevant, I think, as is the employment training panel funding. And then on the federal level, we have DOL grants, and I also call out WANTO grants, which are the Women in Apprenticeship and Non-Traditional Occupations. So these
Adele,
are—
can I
Yeah.
insert one thing so that people, we often get the question, where's all the USDOL money we're supposed to be able to go after? So I just want to say very briefly,
Yeah.
yes, the USDOL is investing in apprenticeship. It is very hard to access. And people should not have any kind of illusions that it's like going after a DAS grant. That's the one. I can say, I'm not going to say more. This is your presentation. People can talk to me about that. The other thing I want to call out is, and this I have in writing from the DOL, ECE is absolutely not considered part of the Want-To effort.
Yeah.
What they
Yeah.
talk about, they're talking about getting women into construction and into whatever. So it's just a dead
Yeah.
end. We did a big proposal. It got, completely rejected. And basically they said, you should never have applied for this. This is not what it's about. So I don't want people to have illusions because then they just get disappointed. That's all I'll say.
Totally. Yep. So I'm painting the big picture here, and
Right.
I will narrow it to what I think are like the ECE specific funding, but I wanted to just give like the big picture in case folks wanted to pull the string on something. But yeah, absolutely. So the things here that I will call out is that so I mentioned that in this budget cycle, there was a big increase in the investment in apprenticeship. And so zooming in on those apprenticeship specific funding sources, last year, the state of California spent about $130 million on apprenticeship specific funding. And this year we're spending about $230 million into apprenticeship specific funding, which is both, some sustained and increased investment in mechanisms that already existed, like SAEEI grants, like RSI funding, ETP, but it's also new investments into this apprenticeship innovation funding, the youth apprenticeship funding, and the women in construction priority program. So it's a big increased investment. These are how the numbers work out. And the ones that I'm certainly going to focus on most today are the apprenticeship innovation funding, which is $55 million this year and $175 million over the coming 3 years, and the youth apprenticeship funding, which is $20 million this year and $65 million committed in the coming, over the coming 3 years. So this is the high level numbers. To like zoom the aperture out a bit more, there's a whole lot of sources of apprenticeship adjacent funding, right? And so these are the funding sources that are could be utilized or are commonly utilized by apprenticeship programs, but are not necessarily specifically for apprenticeship. So I would certainly call out philanthropies in this list, and the Irvine Foundation is a big one, specifically in California, that I know has funded a bunch of work with ECEPs. But there's a bunch of great foundations out there that are doing work in this space. The Gates Foundation, Heising-Simons, Silver Giving, Tides. I mean, there's a lot out there. And so I think they tend to be flexible sources of funding. And I think a lot of those entities care a lot about the early care and education space. So I would definitely keep those in consideration. Strong workforce funding is one that flows through the colleges and the K-12 system that I think could be leveraged more for apprenticeship. I'm going to touch a little bit more on the Learning Aligned Employment Program. This is a new source of funding that actually is a rare case of having a wage offset. It's essentially a work-study program being administered through our higher educational institutions, but it absolutely could be utilized for apprenticeship. So I'm going to be sure to tell you a little bit more about that one. The community college apportionment funding, right? Like how community colleges get paid for their full-time equivalent students can absolutely and should be used for ECE apprenticeships if you can. So again, I'll touch more on that one. And then of the rest of these, the ones that I would call out is HRTP grants, which I think I know, Randy, you have been in conversations with them about this early care and education space, which I think is great. And they can be a source of funding for ECE. So it's another one that I would call out from this.
And they have given us a large grant. They've been very supportive of this.
Great. Wonderful to hear that. And then finally, WIOA funding is certainly one that you can work with your local workforce development board and tap into that funding. So of these, those are the ones that I would pluck out. and then to expand the aperture to a gigantic color wheel of apprenticeship funding. This is a lot of like the apprenticeship possible funding. And obviously I'm not going to go through all of this, but the ones I will call out is the early care and education, First Five and Head Start, I think are entities that you should look into. I am not going to claim to be an expert on those, but I wanted to be sure to just call them out to this group because I think that's like a sector specific funding source that can complement the other ones that I will talk about today. And the other one I might call out is the population specific categories. You know, the regional K-12 funding, the CalFresh employment and training. All of these have population orientation to the funding sources, but could be augmentations of funding for your overall operating model. So I have done the work of synthesizing the past few slides that I'm sure feel really overwhelming to zoom in on what I think are the most ECE relevant sources of funding. So of that world of possibilities I just offered, these are the ones I'm going to zoom in on the most. I know the most about the like apprenticeship relevant funding sources as opposed to the, you know, the First Five and the Head Start. So for the remainder of this, I'm going to focus on these ones that I have sort of distilled from the world of possibilities that I think could be most relevant to ECE. But like I said, I would encourage you to also consider the First Five and the Head Start for how you put together your overall equation. So that's trying to take the world of workforce development funding possibilities and narrow it. Now, a different dimension to look at this is like, what does the funding cover? And so I'm just taking the example of thinking about launching a new ECE program, right? That's what we're here to talk about. And when you think about the costs that go into running an apprenticeship program, I think it sort of separates into three categories of the employer costs, right? Like covering the cost of wages, benefits, the on-the-job training, the costs around that body of work of the intermediary, which I talked about at the top, the overhead of running the program, registering it, recruiting the apprentices, placing them, supporting them, all of that. And then the cost of the training, right? The classroom training, the instruction, reporting, all of that. So I've taken those same buckets of funding that were in that last slide and sort of organized them a bit by what I think they can cover. And I mentioned earlier the learning aligned employment program. Typically, I set the expectation with employers that employers are covering the cost of wages because I think that's the right expectation to set when you're setting up an apprenticeship program. However, this learning aligned employment program can offset wages from 50 to 90%, depending on who the host employer is. And in the education space, I think it can be closer to 90% wage offset, which is kind of incredible. So I just wanted to be sure to call that one out to you all. I'll dive more into the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding and the grants, but I think that grants can provide, like the Youth Apprenticeship Grant or the HRTP or SAEEI grant can provide that helpful startup funding. And our hope is that the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding helps with the ongoing cost of the intermediary costs. And then with an ECE program, I think you would be wisest to focus on covering the training using the new AIF training funding and if possible, tapping into the community college apportionment funding. So that's sort of what these funding sources might cover. And like I said, I think thinking about the sustainability of the funding is really important. So again, I've taken these same buckets of funding and organized them by like what's going to be a large one-time grant, right? Like the CAI grant, the DOL grant, these are big grants. And you can't always go back to them, right? Like it's sort of a one-time, get an infusion of funding to get going, but then you can't like go back to them typically. The strong workforce funding, HRTPs, philanthropies, the youth apprenticeship grant, I think these are more likely, like they have grant cycles. You can go back. It's not only for that like startup phase, but you do need to like continually apply for the grants. Now, what we have at the top here is what I would say is the more sustainable and ongoing sources of funding. You know, obviously employers are the foundation of this, and they are paying the wages, and that's why I say I think it's really important to like set that expectation. But if you're able to set up your program to be tapping into FTEs funding, FTEs is not going anywhere, right? Like that's a very sustainable source of funding. The LEAP funding is $500 million between now to be spent down between now and 2029. So that's a pretty solid source of funding. Obviously, I think WIOA funding is also not going anywhere. So these are like the more sustainable sources of funding. The AIF funding, which I will speak to, as you saw, for now, it's a 3-year budget allocation. I can't in good integrity say that it is the same level of sustainability as FTEs is. But the intent of it is to be an annual source of funding that you can come to cover the cost of running your apprenticeship program. So we do want it to be seen as part of that more sustainable category of funding that's helping programs to sustain and scale what they're doing. So I've attempted to sort of bring these two dimensions together when thinking about launching an ECE program, and we have these same categories on the left, but on the right, I sort of separated it into like the startup phase versus the sustaining phase, or sustain and scale really. And so when putting together a program, you can see that these grants, like a DOL grant, an HRTP grant, a CAI grant, or foundation funding, is really important to help you get going, right? Like these are the funding sources that will help you go from zero to something, right? Because in order to tap into the AIF funding, which I'm going to go into more in a moment, you have to be running already. You have to have apprentices in order to get the funding, much like with FTEs, you have to have been educating the students to tap into that funding. And so our hope is that this AIF funding becomes more of that sustain and scale part of the funding when that initial grant funding runs out. So this is a little bit of a way to try to bring these components together. So that's a little bit of a way to help you think about the overall landscape of funding. So I want to talk a little bit more about these new funding sources. So the Apprenticeship Innovation Funding, the intent of it, like I said at the very beginning, it ties into that 5-point strategy. The intent of it is that we want to be fostering a whole ecosystem of apprenticeship intermediaries. So the intent of this funding is to support these multi-employer IACA apprenticeship programs. And it's $175 million over 3 years. In this budget year, we have $55 million to administer. And the funding has these 2 different categories to it. So the first category we call support funding, and that is to really cover the cost of running an apprenticeship program. So it's really thinking about those intermediary costs with the support funding. And then the second part is the training funding, and that's thinking about covering the cost of running the cost of training apprentices. So again, this funding source is entirely focused on IACA apprentices, and the training part is trying to be a slightly more agile mechanism to tap into for new apprenticeship programs. And there's some links in here if you want to like geek out on the Budget Act and things like that that establish this. But the important things in terms of like eligibility for the apprenticeship funding is that you have to be an IACA program, you have to be registered with the California Division of Apprenticeship Standards. We work a lot with DOL and do love to dual register programs as much as possible. But if a program is only federally registered, they are not going to be eligible for this funding. So you do have to be DAS registered to be eligible for the funding. And the idea is that this funding is available to the programs that exist. So you don't have to be a brand new program to tap into this. And we do have a wage standard that we're setting for this. That is, we're collaborating with ETP in terms of setting the wage standard. But we, like ETP, are being inclusive of health benefits. So that can be part of the compensation package when meeting that wage standard. So I'll give an introduction to this, but know that on the DAS website, there is a very detailed draft guidelines document. The deadline for public comment on that closed a few days ago, but the document is still up there if you would like to see that draft set of guidelines. So we're now digesting all the public comment, and we'll be releasing the final version of it in 2023. So the AIF support side of things, the dollar amount is $3,500 per active apprentice per year, and that's going to be prorated to the month. So if your apprentice started in, July 1st, you just get 50% of that funding, right? So it's going to be based on the apprentices that you have registered with DAS. And then there's going to be a $1,000 completion bonus that gets paid to the program sponsor when an apprentice completes. And the idea of this funding is that you will apply, the program sponsor will apply once a year, and it will be looking backwards at the previous calendar year. So what we're aiming to do is open applications in the first quarter of 2023, and it's going to be looking at the apprenticeship database for all of 2022 to say how many apprentices did you serve in 2022, and that's the amount of money that you can receive from DAS. So in terms of the eligible applicants for the support funding, this should look like a very familiar list because it's the list of people who could be apprenticeship intermediaries. And in our DAS language, we also, that sort of formal term is the registered sponsor for an apprenticeship program. And it can include any of these different entity types. And one sort of newish thing in here is that historically CSUs and UCs have not been eligible for previous apprenticeship funding sources, and they absolutely are eligible for AIF. On the training side of things, the intent of this funding is to be, a slightly more agile mechanism to tap into. It's going to mirror a lot of aspects of RSI. So if you know that system, it's similar to that, but again, trying to be a more agile mechanism to tap into than RSI. RSI has been historically used a lot by the CAC apprentices, and the idea of this AIF training is that it's specifically for IACA apprentices. But it's benchmarked to the same dollar amount. So it's $882 per training hour. And it will, again, be benchmarked to whatever the RSI rate is. And it's the same annual application process. However, what is one step different about the eligible applicants is that it is only the local education agencies that can apply for this funding. So the LEA that's associated with your program is going to be the one to be applying for this funding source, because the intent of it is to cover the cost of training, right? So like I said, the process and timeline that we're aiming for is that applications will be open in the first quarter of the year. So sometime January to March of every year that we have this funding, applications will be open, and it's going to be based on the number of apprentices that you served in the previous year. And there is an application process because we need to know that you are requesting this funding, but it is not a competitive solicitation process. This is not a grant. This is formula funding that is based on the number of apprentices that you are serving. And it's more like RSI in that there's not a contract process. There's not, the evaluation process is a check on your eligibility, and then you get the funding. So we're aiming for payments to be issued in the May to August timeline. So this is our goal. Obviously, 2023 will be our first round of actually deploying this funding. So we're hustling to try to meet this, but the idea is that this will be an annual cycle. Every year that you're running your program, you can come and apply for this funding and then receive it, as long as the California legislature decides to fund it. So, and it has made a commitment of the coming 3 years as a pilot of this funding source. So that is AIS. I wanted to be sure to touch quickly on CAI because it's open. I am mindful of time, so I'm going to zoom through this a little bit because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So the CAI grants are both for pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs they use non-traditional, emerging, innovative. I would just say IACA. They're focused on IACA programs. And this cycle is a little bit different than previous cycles because they have a few different grant types. And the 3 different grant types are program planning, implementation, and expansion.
Adele,
yeah.
Sorry, I think in the interest of time,
Yeah.
I think the people on this call have been very closely attuned to what's going on with the CAI grant. There's some specific questions they have about that, but we can get to that in the Q&A. I'm tracking the questions.
Okay, great. So I'll just say the final thing on that. December
Sure.
16th is the deadline. So hopefully you're already organized on this one.
Yes.
So the other one that I'll touch on quickly is youth apprenticeship. So we now have youth apprenticeship as a stated priority for DAS. Youth apprenticeship right now is simply defined as apprentices age 16 to 24. That's what a youth apprenticeship is right now. But we are in the process of convening an advisory committee around this, which is legislatively mandated. And the intent of this committee is to look at the definitions around youth apprenticeship, to advise the state on how we structure our work around youth apprenticeship, and also to provide a bit of guidance around the use of the funds. So the funding, like I said, is $65 million over 3 years. And the funding definitely has a focus on opportunity use in the intent of the funding in the legislation, which is linked here for anyone who wants to geek out on it. And so DAS is administering this fund, and this will be a competitive grant process. So the solicitation is not yet out for this, but we are close to convening the committee and kicking off that work. So youth apprenticeship is really exciting. It's a potentially huge body of work that some great folks have, I bet included in this room, have piloted some work around, but I think there's huge possibility for expansion. So stay tuned, and I'm sure I'll come back to this group to talk more about youth apprenticeship once we sort of have more to share. And I think I just wanted to touch in one slide about this LEAP funding. It's administered by the Student Aid Commission. Well, the Student Aid Commission got the money. They have passed it in a formula fashion to the community colleges, the CSUs, and the UCs. So all of those educational institutions have received like their allotment of LEAP funding, and each of these educational institutions is now deploying it. The intent of it is really that it's a funding for a work-study program to offset the wages of a work-study program. They want more students to be working and learning, which sounds great to me because that really aligns with apprenticeship. And what is unique about this funding source is that it offsets wages, and it can cover, in the context of ECE, 50% for nonprofits and up to 90% for public schools. So that's kind of enormous. And I know wages is a tricky thing in ECE. So I just wanted to be sure to touch on this. And it's also $500 million worth of funding to be used over the coming years, by 2031. So if you're interested in learning more about this, talk to your educational institutions because they're the ones who are actually holding the money now. So link here if you want to pull the thread on this one. And I think I'm going to just say one more thing before I go to questions, which is to those of you who are working in collaboration with community colleges, and I know community colleges play a really important role often in training for the ECE workforce. Know that apprentices, based on this memo here, apprentices can have all of their fees waived for classes that they take in community colleges associated with an apprenticeship. And so no apprentice should be charged an enrollment fee, but also no grant, no employer, no nonprofit should be charged for those classes either. If they are 4-credit community college classes, the fees should be waived. And that is clearly articulated in a memo, but I think still being operationalized. So given that we're doing a deep dive here, I wanted to be sure to speak to that. And in the climate of all these different funding sources, I think when you're working with colleges, it's important for them to know that there are 3 different ways now for the education of an apprentice to be covered: the FTEs funding, RSI funding, or AIFT, and they have to pick one of these 3. It's not there's no and here. This is an either or. So you can't have duplication, you can't be tapping into more than one of these. But as you can see, they should all be benchmarked at approximately the same dollar amount per training hour. I say approximately because FTEs is probably a bit more when you apply the student-centered funding formula to it. But the idea is that the base rate for 4-credit class is $8.82 per training hour, and that's consistent across these 3 sources. So lots of ways to cover the cost of training for apprentices. So I think I will pause there and see what questions we have.
So I'm gonna feed you a couple of the questions, and we'll see what else comes up. So first, you ended at the perfect place, because I'm sure people are on the edge of their chair about this. Can you back up one slide? I'll be able to ask the question more easily. Sorry, one more. Oh,
well, just tell me what slide, which
the one that showed it doesn't matter. Let me just ask the question.
Yeah.
Because I can't remember now. I thought it was one, but anyways, okay. Go back to the last slide then, because that's the best way to ask this. The one you ended up on with the FTEs and keep going. Yeah. There. Okay.
Great.
I'm going to read you the question because it's more succinct than if I try to explain it. Okay. At the recent CAI Bidders Conference webinar, they said that if you're applying for a CAI grant, you must use CAI funding to pay for instruction, and you're not allowed to use RSI or apportionment. And there's no choice about that. And so the question is, do you have any updates about that? Is that correct or incorrect? Because if it's correct, it has a huge implication. Here you are trying to get money to support a program, and instead of being able to use that money for things no one else will pay for, you actually have to write off the cost of all these courses before you even can start to think about the CAI budget, which seems like it's the opposite of what you were just explaining on this slide.
Yeah, so I have to be a bit careful because I am not the administering entity on CAI grants. The chancellor, the California Community College Chancellor's Office, is the one administering the CAI grants. We did ask this question at a recent, I was there for a question that came towards Sean McCobb, who is the one at the Chancellor's Office who's running that program. And what he answered in that forum, so I'll just do my best to paraphrase, is to say that, the intent of CAI is to get new programs going, and the cost of covering the education should not be paid for twice. So you shouldn't be charging courses to a CAI grant while also collecting FTEs on those courses. So in that forum, he suggested that folks should get in touch with him, because that's the important nuance to that.
Is to not double dip.
Yes.
Right. But the message hasn't been that. The message has been you cannot. So I don't want to push you. You can't say more than you can say. But what I will just add, and I'll go to the next question, is that
Okay.
probably everyone on this call knows the facts, the FAQs are not posted yet. The grant is due in 2 weeks and they have not posted the FAQs. And this is a question that has come up over and over again. So all I can say to the rest of the folks on this call is we all need to send questions into that website that they've given us a million times to say, A, where are the FAQs? And B, to ask this question again.
Yeah.
That's as much guidance as we can give. So I'm not gonna, okay, so I can't keep up with the chat. Let me go on and we'll get back to the chat. Okay,
Okay.
next is, can you go back to slide 11? This one I wrote down which number it was, so we won't
Oh,
get screwed up.
good.
Okay, what I want to understand here is because in 2023 and 2024, there's those lightly shaded areas. Is that
Yeah.
saying that there will not be that money in those years?
So, no, that's to say that we think that will be, but we have to wait for the budget process to see what that will be. So in the case of AIF and youth apprenticeship and women in construction, it was stated in this year's budget that they plan to fund these things at these levels over the coming 3 years, whereas they didn't say we are going to fund CAI at $30 million for the coming 3 years. They have funded it at $30 million this year and last year. So we're assuming they'll do it again next year, but we don't know. That's why
Okay.
it's grayed out. And same thing with RSI, like RSI sometimes changes. So that's why those numbers are grayed out, just because of uncertainty, not because it won't be funded.
And is there a reason that there's the minus in front of the 88, but not in front of the
Oh,
30?
it's a squiggle, it's a squiggle.
Oh, that's
approximately.
what, okay, got it. All right, that takes care of that. All right, so now let me get back to the questions here. On all the funding, you can close your slide. Well, keep
It's okay,
them.
I'll just leave them there.
Okay.
I can skip around.
Okay, so in all the funding where it listed that funding was available to CSUs, UCs, and community colleges, are private and nonprofit colleges simply not included in any of these equations?
So the way that apprenticeship works in California is that you have to have a link to some branch of our public education system in order to be a registered apprenticeship in California. So if you're a private school of any brand, like that is not a branch of the public education system. That doesn't mean you can't do apprenticeship training. It just means that you need to, like, that private entity needs to create a linkage with one of these branches of the public education system, the K-12, the county offices of education. I will say, like, of this list, the county offices of education have been the most flexible partner in this, in terms of being an apprenticeship training partner to training entities that are not in the public education system. So if a partner falls into that private category, that's probably where I would point them to have some conversations with a county office of education, and DAS, we can help make some of those linkages if it's helpful.
So the county office could basically function as the go-between, or the, you know, be the spot, the LEA, but the university they're working with is this private or nonprofit. And so
Could
are you
be.
basically, yeah, for example, yeah. So you're basically saying they're not included because this is state money and they're not state institutions? Is that kind of what you're saying? State system institutions?
Yeah, I mean, basically we provide state funding. We have, like, what is California apprenticeship is that we require a link to our public education system. And that's intentional for a bunch of reasons. I don't want to, like, wax too philosophical on this one, but, you know, we want our educational institutions to be linked to employers,
Right.
and to be training our students for jobs. And a great way to link them is to say apprenticeship programs need to work with some part of our public education institutions, so that work-based learning, that employer connection is happening with our public education system. So this is one mechanism by which we do that, but it's also a way that we ensure quality, right? Because we as the state set a lot of the standards around the educational quality, and our educational institutions have lots of processes in place to uphold that quality of education, and we want that there for our apprentices as well. So yeah.
So, okay, so I appreciate that response, but because I know you to be a woman of innovation, I'm just gonna throw something at you for you to chew over, and anybody on the call who disagrees is welcome to, put it in the chat and I'll call on you. What I want the state to understand is that, I don't know about other sectors, this is a gathering of ECE today. Very often, the system, especially when you get beyond the community colleges, is so rigid as to be almost impossible for us to utilize with apprenticeships. They're rigid around things like one time we were trying to use one of the Cal States to launch a new cohort. And we were talking in January for a cohort that was going to launch in August. And we were told, oh, well, they can't start in August. We said, why? They said, well, they would have had to have applied by November. And when you're doing new program development and you're doing recruitment, and they were unmovable. Where a nonprofit university said, well, sure, as long as we can get them registered before the program starts, there's no problem. That's just as an example of the rigidities you hit into. To me, this falls into the greater bucket of equity and access. And our experience has been, and not with just one CSU, with many CSUs, they are very rigid. They are very married to their processes. The community colleges have their own challenges around trying to be innovative. I don't have the impression that most of the CSUs even try to be innovative. I'm being I shouldn't say it that way, but you get my point. Whereas the nonprofit and private universities often have much more flexibility. They're much more willing to try new things. So I'm saying that to say, if you don't have an outside, sort of a voice from the outside of a university who says, wait, you can do it a different way. Here's an example. Then you've got all the same people around the table talking to each other, and they're all going to think they're all fine. So this is a big conversation to have. I understand the logic about state funding, but it creates an unintended consequence that heavily impacts equity and access. And since in ECE, getting a BA is critical, and it will only be more so as time goes on, which also sets us apart. A lot of these apprenticeships, they don't even think about an AA, much less a BA. So I wanted you to have that perspective. You and I can talk further, but I want you to understand why that's a very difficult, that's a real impediment by making it, they're just not part of the system. So I will stop there and get off my whatever soapbox. Okay, back to the list of questions. What time is it? Oh gosh. Okay, let's see. Hold on a second. I got to flip through this. I'm not going to ask these questions about waivers because that's not Adele's thing. That's the whole, you have to ask the questions about getting waivers about that whole SAEEI funding thing to the SAEEI folks. Private call, yes. Okay, we pretty much got through it. I guess, let me, as long as there's another minute.
So one thing okay, if there's no other questions, I'd love to just respond a little bit to you, Randy, on the education piece.
Great.
One thing that is interesting to look at other countries that are doing apprenticeship, and Switzerland, Germany, UK, France, Australia, all of these places are places with more apprenticeship than we have here in the US. And so it's interesting to look at those models and to look at the structure of them and the sort of resulting system of apprenticeship that has emerged. And in Switzerland and in Germany, there is a very tight link between the education system and apprenticeship. And the result is that the whole education system has more of an orientation towards workforce development. And there's, in Switzerland, for example, there's tons of permeability between apprenticeship and higher education, in the sense that the equivalent of the president of Switzerland started their career as an apprentice, right? And people might start a youth apprenticeship in high school and then do an apprenticeship for 2 or 3 years and decide they like or don't like an occupation, and then go in to get their university degree in something, and then build their career from there. Or others might go into an apprenticeship and decide, great, this is the career, this is my path, I'm going to keep going on this path and not go back to higher education. but the systems are really built together so that like somebody is getting educational credit for the apprenticeship that they've done. They're like really moving in a permeable way. A totally different approach is in the UK, where they went for like a quick market-based approach. And they just said, okay, you're going to get, you know, $15,000 per apprentice that you train and place into an apprenticeship. Go. And what happened is a totally bifurcated system, which is you either go the vocational track of apprenticeship, and that's the track you go, and you never go to university, or you go the 4-year track. And there's no permeability between the two systems.
Right.
And I'm impressed by the UK system, by how quickly, like, they set up that mechanism in like 2008, 2010, and they have a ton of apprenticeships, like way more proportionally than we do in the US, but they have a bifurcated model. And in the US, like DOL apprenticeship does not require an LEA. Like it's the free form sort of UK-ish model.
Right.
And I'm worried about that creating a totally bifurcated structure, which we as the US have too much legacy of like tracking people into one or the other. So I actually like really believe in trying to keep this connection to our education system. And certainly, like as we do youth apprenticeship, this is going to be a really important thing for us to think about, is how do we build a system that does have that permeability, so that apprenticeship is a work-based learning experience that anybody might want to get, whether they want to become an electrician, a K-12 teacher, or the president of the United States. Like apprenticeship is a cool pathway to explore, and it can be part of building your workforce and educational portfolio that leads to success. And so I will keep my stake in this.
Well, let me just say two really, before people jump off, let me just say two really quick things. We are all about higher ed. We are all about degrees. But to say that by not including privates and nonprofits, you're saying they're not part of the educational system. Aren't Harvard and Yale private universities? You can't say only state-funded higher ed counts in a system. Because we're not talking about these fly-by-night online that have scandals. We're talking about legitimate, certified, accredited universities. So if you're going to talk about linking apprenticeship to education, that's one thing. You're talking about linking apprenticeship to state-funded education. That's where the mistake is. That's number one. Number two, I've studied these other systems too, and there's one very big difference. They do not have the diversity that we are struggling with here in this, or that we both have, which is a good thing, but also we're not set up for. So when I've talked to people and I've said, where does equity fit in? They've literally said to me, equity isn't an issue. We don't worry about equity. Apprenticeship is so ingrained in the system that they don't think of it as an equity issue. It's just another pathway. That is a game-changing statement. And then the last thing I'd say about that is, oh shoot, I'm hurrying and I forgot. There was one more thing I wanted to say about, that the problem also is, and this isn't just true at DAS, this is true at DOL. They're trying to implement policies from other countries, but those other countries have full, robust systems in place. We don't have an apprenticeship system quite as robust, let's put it that way. And so you can't necessarily impose policies that came as an endpoint in a particular country where we're at more of a starting point. And so that's part of the complexity of it. So this is a very good conversation. I appreciate you grappling with it. You know, you and I will discuss this more. But I did want to leave you with that thought about private ed. To leave it out is a strategic and policy. It's a mistake. It will only make things harder for everybody. And it is a legitimate form of higher ed. So on that note, I want to thank you very, very much. I want to thank everybody for coming, and we will make the slides available. And let's go, hound the DAS to get our questions. Not the DAS, the Chancellor's Office, to get our questions answered about the SAEEI applications. Okay, with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks again. And Adele, thank you so, so much.
Yeah, thank you.